Today's video, we're going to be talking about how to invest confidently and avoid catastrophe by reviewing flood maps. Now, the floods have been a massive issue here in southeast Queensland. Brisbane has had some major flooding over the last few decades. We had the 1974 floods, which was devastating for the city. Then 2011, and most recently in 2022. Now, people are taking a look at these flood maps across Brisbane City, across Logan City, Moreton Bay, Redland City Council, and people are not understanding what they're seeing or reading on these maps. In my opinion, I never want to buy in a flood area. There are some very rare occasions where we've bought flood properties, whether they're on the coastline or along the bayside, walking distance to the water. That could be the rare occasion where it does make sense to buy in a flood-prone area. But for most of our buyers and most investors and homeowners, we're going to want to avoid these flood locations. Now, there are different types of flooding. We've got overland flow, we've got river flooding, we've got flash flooding. There's all these different types of flooding as well. So you need to be aware of what potentially affects the property you're looking at buying and how large is the risk. The first thing you need to do is actually find the flood maps. So if you jump into Google and type flood maps Brisbane, hit enter. Then you're going to get all of these results as you can see on screen. But the one you're going to want to click on is flood awareness map here for Brisbane City Council. Now, each council has their own flood map. So you do need to be aware that you need to go to Brisbane City Council for those properties in that location or in that local government area. We're also going to take a look at Logan City's flood maps a little bit later, because there are some major changes that the council has made to their flood maps and some things you need to be aware of that could potentially allow you to buy a property or not buy a property based on this information. So before we dive into the flood maps itself, let's take a look at some of the explanations of how these flood maps work. You can see here, understanding flood likelihood and impact. Before searching for a property in Brisbane City Council's flood awareness map, it's important to understand the flood likelihood and impact. The terms likelihood and impact are used by council to explain the chances of floods occurring. These floods are used in the flood awareness map, which is an awareness tool to display the probability of flood occurring from one or more sources: creek, river, or storm tide. It also shows the impact of overland flow flooding, which is a lot of heavy rain and water running across. The flood awareness map does not provide information about the depth or speed of the floodwater. The flood awareness map uses the term likelihood to describe the chance of river, creek, and storm tide flooding happening annually. This is something a lot of people misunderstand, that the percentage likelihood is the annual likelihood. If it's a 1% likelihood, it doesn't mean it's a 1 in 100-year flood. It's that there's a 1% chance each year that this flooding could occur. Let me say that again, because some people don't understand how we could have a 2022 and a 2011 floods only 10 years apart. It's because the percentage likelihood the council puts down on these flood maps is the likelihood of a percentage in each year that that flooding could occur, not a percentage across a century. So as you can see here, here are the main categories, and these are typically consistent across local government areas or different councils. So you've got a very high likelihood that there's a 1 in 20 chance that type of flooding might occur in any given year, a medium likelihood, which is the 1% chance of flooding in that given year, a very low likelihood, 1 in 500, or very rare occurrences, so 0.05%. And we will genuinely buy properties that sit in very low likelihoods or low likelihoods and also sit in overland flow locations if you understand the on-the-ground look and feel of an area, that you look at the historical flooding, and you take this map into account. It's about taking all the information together, also looking at the property on the ground. A lot of people will make a decision just based off a flood map. My childhood home has overland flow path, has some flooding mapping on it, and I'll show you that a little bit later, because it's never flooded, not in the last 30 years. So there are some circumstances where it does make sense to buy with a little bit of overland flow or low likelihood flooding. And if you're buying in a high flooding likelihood area, it's about understanding that risk and probability of flooding happening. So let's dive into the awareness map, because we're not going to take any more time unpacking the definitions and data. You're going to accept the terms once they accept, and then you want to look at the flood awareness map itself. So we're clicking in, we're waiting for it to load, and it's bringing up this beautiful map of Brisbane. You can see the brown snake here, which is Brisbane's river. That's how we locals call it. You can look at the airport over here, and it's completely underwater. So I think when they were building that second runway, they were talking about building a pancake on a jelly cake, something like that. But there's a lot of flooding that goes on, obviously, around the port of Brisbane, around the river out there. So you can see some of Brisbane's premier areas do have some significant flooding. I look at Windsor and Wilston and Newmarket. You can see the Enoggera Creek running through here. Now let's take a look at this inner city Brisbane area and unpack some of this flood mapping. So on screen here, you can see a map of Brisbane. Obviously, you can zoom right out and get a much bigger picture of areas, north and south. We've got our offices here in Greenslopes, for example, if I zoom in, and you can see some of these areas have significant flooding. But let's look at that north side, that premier area in Windsor and Wilston, and take a look at some of these different mapping types. So when you're looking at these maps, you can see this orange shading here. The orange shading typically represents overland flow path. And if you click on a set property, it will also give you a flood report, which you can then run and get some more information about the home. So in this property at 66 Grove Street in Albion, it says river flooding is a low likelihood. Creek is unlikely, storm tide is low likelihood, and overland flow is likely. So that's why there's multiple colors here. You can see there's a very light blue, and then a blue with a shade, and then the orange coloring. If you click on the flood report, it will give you that more detailed information. For the purposes of today's video, we can open this one up and take a look. Now on screen here, you can see there's a lot more data around this report. So it actually tells you, the address, it'll give you those percentages, it'll also tell you the type of flooding down below and give you historical flooding if available. It's also great to see what the flooding levels were in Feb 2022, and you may be able to look at some historical maps online to see if you can get aerial shots of the area that you're looking in. So you can see over to the left here that the height of the 2022 floods in February were 4.2 meters, and that the percentage likelihood of flooding on this property is around 1% and affects 75 to 100% of the property that's on the map. To be perfectly honest, the rest of this information is more of a rehash around ground levels and the types of flooding and the percentage likelihoods as well. Now for my money, I'm typically not going to look in any areas which have a dark blue or a moderate blue. We will consider some properties with this light blue, and we'll also look at the flood mapping and get an understanding of the area. In the last 6 months, we've bought several properties which have had a light mapping on them, but never flooded. Not in the 2022 floods, not in the 2011 floods. For example, say you're looking at this property over here, and then you go to the property on the ground and see that's just the backyard, has some flood mapping, but you get a sense of the elevation of the property. You have a look at some of the historical aerial footage as well of the location, and you look at the flood maps here, and you can make a calculated and educated decision around that flooding risk. There's always going to be a risk of flooding, and this may change over time. The flooding maps that we have now in 2024 are likely to be remapped over the next 3, 5, 10 years. So you need to take that into account. But for my money, I personally wouldn't be buying my home or an investment property in a dark blue or a moderate blue area. The reason is that they have those higher percentage chances of flooding. Like we looked at before, if it's got a 20%, so it's a very dark blue, or a 5%, which is a moderate blue, or even a 2%, I don't like those likelihoods. I only really would consider properties with a sub 1% chance of flooding in any given year. So it's pretty straightforward. Take a look at the maps, run a flood report for your specific property. Let's take a quick look at Logan City Council because there are some cases where flood mapping isn't 100% accurate. So to jump onto Logan, you just need to type in the Logan PD Hub. This is a property's address that we looked at recently. 8 Sweetgum Street in Hillcrest or 5 Sweetgum Street in Hillcrest was a recent client video, and that client is doing some major renovations. Now, we ran a flood report for that property and there were no flooding concerns. Very similar to Brisbane City Council, you'll be able to get a property summary. So this was the property we did a recent client purchase review on, which is on the YouTube channel if you want to see that. And you can see you can run a flood report and there's no flood concerns in the center of Hillcrest in this suburb. But let's look at my childhood home. So if we look at 14 Cameron Court in Daisy Hill, you can obviously type in the address, search up the property, and you can see here, this property's got flood mapping over it. It's a light blue, there's dark blue behind it where there's a overland flow path, and then it's got some yellow and some gray. The really interesting thing is I lived in this property for over 20 years and not an ounce of flooding occurred. The swimming pool never had flooding, the front of the property never had flooding, the street never had flooding. So it's really interesting to see some of council's mapping. All of these homes here have never flooded. This property in the back corner where there is dark blue, I know their back of their fence in the backyard did have some flooding at periods of time. But as far as the homes were concerned, they've never had flooding, even though they're graded as a moderate risk area. So it's important to understand the risks, especially these yellow and grey mappings. Now, Logan City Council has remapped their flood maps in recent times, and some of our client properties that weren't ever on a flood map now might have some grey over the top of them, or they even might have some yellow in some cases. And in those circumstances, those properties may have never flooded. They might have ultimately a very low risk, but council has decided for whatever reason to include those homes in that flooding risk. For example, I would never expect this home here to have any flooding risk. This property is on a hill, this property is on the lower side of the hill, and these properties sit further down than this property here. This is a very shallow stormwater outtake. It's not actually a creek, there's no creek there. There is creek further down away from this property. So you need to take the flood maps with a grain of salt. Obviously use that data for your information. In my case, for Logan City maps, I would very much consider grey and yellow areas, which are the very low likelihoods. Also, in some cases, council could put a light blue over a house, which is a 5% or a 2% likelihood, but that house is never flooded. So use these information maps to your advantage, understand how they work, understand that they're not always correct, and make an educated and an informed decision. Obviously, as a buyer's agent, we do this legwork for all of our clients. When clients work with us, we do 2 levels of due diligence. We do an initial level of due diligence when scoping properties, breaking down the price, the rental guide, and key points around why we like the deal. And then the second level of due diligence, we pull apart flood reports. We do 1-page summaries. We do detailed comparable market analysis. And we have contacts here on the ground that can help with surveying, help with town planning, help with developing, subdividing, granny flats, the list goes on. We also offer renovation services. So if you buy an ugly duckling and you want to add value to the property, then we also offer those services for a 20% fee. So whether you're looking to buy an investment property or your own home, make sure you use these flood maps during your searches and understand how they work. If you want to sit down and have a chat with myself and you're looking to buy a property here in Southeast Queensland, head over to purposeproperty.com.au to book in a free strategy session. If you want to see a playlist of some recent client deals, click that playlist somewhere over here or there, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.